Good morning, good afternoon. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. And it's just after 10 o'clock here in California. We hope everyone is continuing to do well and that they're healthy and managing the situation. We're delighted for the third and next installment of our Critical Minerals and the Energy Transition webinar series, co-hosted by the Institute of the Americas and the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. For those who've not joined the series, welcome. And we look forward to having you with us today. Today's presentation is The Future of Clean Energy Demands Critical Mineral Policy Solutions. For those who've joined us before, you've seen a couple of other presentations that have gotten into the general discussion of critical minerals and energy security, and then a very specific governance initiative last week was, or actually earlier this week, was presented by the State Department. And today we're very pleased to dive much more deeply into the intersection of policymaking in critical minerals and energy and the energy transition specifically. So quick reminder, just in case somebody hasn't joined us before, we use the chat function for chat. And by the way, continue to engage one another. We've loved all the dynamic back and forth we've seen on the chat during the course of our webinar series. So feel free to continue in that vein. And of course, if you would like to pose a question for our speaker, Jesse Edmondson, you can do so. I just wrote the word question, so you can avail yourself of the chat function to post questions for our speaker. And as always, don't feel that you need to wait until the end of the formal presentation. If you have a question you'd like to queue up, fire it at us during the course of the presentation. We'll get through those as much as we can at the Q&A portion. So let me formally introduce our speaker, and it's a pleasure to have with us Jesse Edmondson. Among various hats, he's the CEO of U.S. Critical Minerals. And the great thing about Jesse is he's a geologist. He has a MA and he has a BA from the University of Arkansas in geology. But he's not only a geologist, he's somebody who's worked deeply on stakeholder engagement, community engagement issues in the mineral space. And he is somebody who's worked particularly at the U.S. federal level on policy and policy making around critical minerals. And so that's the piece of Jesse's experience that we've asked him to share with us. And as the title of the webinar suggests, he's going to really tell us what he thinks in terms of what policy and policy solutions we need and we should be thinking about to drive the future of clean energy. So without any further ado, let me throw it over to Jesse and welcome him today. Thanks so much, Jesse, for joining us. We look forward to your insights on policymaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And yeah, thank you to the Institute of the Americas and the Payne Institute for hosting this excellent webinar series on critical minerals. It's been a real pleasure to watch the first two seminars, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So I'm going to start with just a short shameless plug for my current work affiliation. So Critical Resources Consulting is my personal consulting company that provides technical and government relations support for various exploration, mining, and critical mineral related projects. And then U.S. Critical Minerals is a small private mineral exploration company that I co-founded in 2019 with my partner, Dr. Robert Cook, which is focused on building out a portfolio of critical mineral assets in the United States, mainly focused on battery-related minerals and rare earths. And then I've also recently joined G&W Consulting, which is a Toronto-based expert advisory group that provides a range of services for supporting battery material, rare earth, and additive manufacturing projects. Okay, so let's start with just kind of a definition of a critical mineral to make sure that we're all on the same page. And here's just kind of an abbreviated version based on the United States Geological Survey's definition, which basically says this, that critical minerals are essential to economic and national security. Okay, they are particularly vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, and they serve an essential function in the manufacturing of a product that we cannot live without. Okay, and so different governments and agencies maintain their own critical minerals list based on what is important to them and how they are vulnerable. And these lists are meant to be dynamic and change over time as technology, economies, and supply chains evolve. Okay, so we look at the graph on the right. It has kind of the critical minerals list, and it certainly illustrates our severe vulnerability and reliance. mainly to China. Okay, and then we note that for 15 of these minerals, we are actually 100% dependent on imports of these raw materials. And as you look at this list, I want to point out that these are mainly actually elements that are determined to be critical. Okay, so when we think elements, think periodic table. Okay, so let's review some very basic geology 101. Okay, so elements are atoms. Okay, so think pure form, and they have a very specific and unique properties. Okay, and elements can occur naturally. So for example, native gold or silver, but they're more commonly found in combinations with other elements to form minerals. Okay, and then when we think of rocks, rocks are made up of minerals, whether they're sedimentary, metamorphic, or igneous. And I'm pointing this out because what is actually critical is that we have access to materials that are technology ready. This is what is in demand and where our current supply chains are most vulnerable. And modern technology utilizes these kind of very unique properties of elements or specialized compounds to kind of the magic of modern technology. And so we're really talking about high purity specialty chemicals and advanced materials. So there are two parts to solving these supply chain issues. Okay, the first being mining. Okay, so we do have to go excavate, at a very generalized sense, we have to go out, we have to excavate the rocks, we have to process these rocks into a mineral concentrate. Okay, and this is all typically done kind of right at the mine site. But the second component of this is really an advanced material manufacturing, okay, which is the actual conversion of these materials from what would be considered kind of a run-of-mine mineral concentrate into a usable technology-ready material. And in order for most new critical mineral projects to be economically competitive globally, they have to be vertically integrated, meaning they have to do both the mining and the advanced processing components. Okay, let's look real quickly at graphite as an example. Okay, this is a critical mineral that I've worked the most with over the last 8 years. Okay, graphite is a naturally occurring crystalline form of carbon, okay, the other being diamond. Graphite has hundreds of uses ranging from pencils to industrial greases to foundry facings and refractories. And historically, the demand for this mineral was driven by the steel industry, where you could sell a run-of-mine graphite concentrate. However, modern demand for graphite is driven by its use in the anode of a lithium-ion battery. And this requires that the graphite be in the form of an ultra-high purity coated spherical graphite. So a very highly specialized advanced material. So the typical process would be to mine the rock, in this case a graphitic schist containing, let's say, approximately 4% graphite or carbon. Okay, so the rock would be excavated, it would be crushed, and then the graphite would be separated through a series of flotation and polishing and grinding stages, which in result would produce a graphite concentrate that can now be somewhere on the order of 95, 96% pure carbon. Okay, and at this stage, the material could be sold into kind of the traditional industrial markets after the flakes were sorted by size. And these products would range somewhere in the range of $500 to $1,000 a ton, kind of depending upon where the market is at any given time. But even though the United States has not mined graphite since the end of World War II, run-of-mine flake graphite is not really in critical supply. It is currently abundant globally. However, specialized ultra-high purity forms of graphite are in demand, and there is a new need for reliable and secure supplies of this high-quality material. So we would take the run-of-mine graphite concentrate, and it can be further upgraded by purification. This is typically done by an acid or heat treatment, and then the purified graphite gets micronized, sized, shaped, and would get this specialty coating that would make it ready to go in the anode of a lithium-ion battery. And as we move from kind of left to right across the screen, we've now upgraded the material and we've increased the sales price by, effectively an order of magnitude. However, the qualification process for getting a new graphite supply into a lithium-ion battery is much more difficult than graphite for industrial markets. So it's a very long and lengthy process to become a new supplier to a battery customer because of the safety and performance requirements of a lithium-ion battery. So a new supplier has to be able to demonstrate that you can produce a consistent, high-quality material repeatedly to meet very specific technical requirements for each customer. This requires not only making sure that you meet the purity requirements for these customers, meaning that in the case of lithium-ion batteries, the kind of minimal accepted purity is 99.95%, but the remaining impurities must also be consistent over time. So the customer doesn't care that the material is always 99.95%. That's important, but what remains in those remaining impurities is important, and it's important that those impurities are consistent every time. Okay, and this qualification process can take several years for lithium-ion batteries. And new customers generally won't initiate the process of qualification until you at least have the demonstration scale capability on your project site. These critical minerals typically lack spot markets. Okay, so I can't go down to the pawn shop and sell graphite, unfortunately. The value is based on long-term contracts of offtake agreements with your customers. And it is difficult to get a project financed past the exploration stage without offtake agreements. And then offtake agreements typically don't happen without qualification. And the necessary kind of on-site demonstration plants that are really required to begin the qualification process, those can cost north of $10 million. But they're not necessarily going to generate positive cash flow. They basically get your foot in the door and give you the opportunity to get into commercial production. So this is kind of a hard sell to investors. So it leads to a real chicken or the egg situation. Okay, and this is not just for graphite. There's a similar process for other battery materials and critical minerals. So, in light of the supply chain vulnerabilities that have been underscored by the ongoing COVID pandemic, it's important to remember that at the root of all supply chains is raw materials. And so when we talk about securing critical mineral supply chains, we are literally talking about all the vital sectors of a modern economy and society. So this means national security, energy security, trade security, food security, health security, and the list goes on. I'm going to focus on some examples related to clean energy supply chains going forward, but I want to point out that this technology is not just green. It is really superior. It's more efficient, and every day it is becoming more affordable. Lithium-ion batteries are not only vital for energy storage technology related to renewables like wind, solar, and electric vehicles, but they're also the preferred technology by our military. The typical soldier can have up to 15 different pieces of technology on them when they're in the field, all these powered by a lithium-ion battery that currently contain battery materials largely sourced from China. This graph is from the Benchmark Minerals Intelligence team. These guys, in my opinion, are the leading authority on kind of the complexities of the lithium-ion battery supply chain, all the way from the mine to the batteries themselves. Okay, and what this graph illustrates is the flow of battery materials from the mine all the way down the supply chain to the different battery manufacturers. Okay, and it clearly highlights that China currently dominates almost the entire lithium-ion battery supply chain, particularly compared to the United States and Europe. Okay, for the sake of this talk, let's just focus on the mining stage. So we're looking in the top left, and on the chemical processing stage, so the top right. And let's just focus on two minerals. Let's do graphite, since we're all experts on graphite now, and then we'll talk about lithium. Okay, so we look at graphite. China controls 65% of the global supply of run-of-mine graphite. But then it controls approximately 100% of the global supply of the battery-ready graphite that's required for the lithium-ion battery market, 100%. Okay, now let's look at lithium. Okay, China actually does not mine a lot of lithium domestically, although it is important to note that they certainly control mines outside of China. But they do have the advanced processing capability to convert mined lithium concentrate into battery-ready lithium. So both lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide. So by having this conversion capability, this allows them to actually control about 60% of the lithium supply as an advanced material ready for use in batteries. Okay, so having the mines is helpful, but what is but it's really somewhat useless from a supply security standpoint without having the advanced manufacturing capability to convert the mine material into a technology-ready product. Okay, so why do we not have new critical mineral supplies coming online in the United States? Is it because we don't have the minerals? This is a common misconception. Okay, no, that's absolutely not the case. The U.S. is a massive and diverse geological terrain, and I'm going to try to illustrate that on the next slide. And it's certainly it's certainly not because we don't have the money. We're a wealthy country, but we're one that really has not invested in mining projects outside of coal for the last 30 plus years. Okay, we know that there's demand in the United States. We are one of the top consumers of this technology. Although it is worth noting that there are uncertainties in the U.S. with regards to the adoption rates of this technology. But underlying this is we know this technology is coming. And we certainly have some of the best infrastructure in the world. And in fact, you look across some of the developing projects across the United States, and some are very close to transportation, power, and water infrastructure. And this represents huge potential CapEx savings compared to other projects around the world. Okay, so this map from the United States Geological Survey is not completely up to date, but it gets the message across. And the fact is that we do have many opportunities to mine critical minerals in the United States. Not only that, we have options. So looking at lithium as a quick example, it can be found in many forms. In the Western United States, there are lithium clay deposits that are being developed, but there's also kind of the traditional brine deposits similar to those in South America. Then if you look in the Southeastern United States, there's a well-known and past-producing hard rock lithium or spodumene district in Western North Carolina. And also in Arkansas, there's lithium associated with existing bromine brine production. So now I want to kind of zoom in on the Southeastern United States, which in my opinion actually has enormous potential to build a regional, vertically integrated supply chain for the electric vehicle market. The southern end of the Appalachians or mountains are mineral rich. So I mentioned the well-known lithium district in Western North Carolina, where you have lithium names like Albemarle and Livent, formerly FMC, that mined this area decades ago for kind of the industrial markets, but they still have some of the processing capabilities in this region. And then there's also been a wave of recent activity from aspiring lithium producer Piedmont Lithium that has really built an impressive land package and resource and proven that they can make battery-grade lithium hydroxide in the lab. My company, U.S. Critical Minerals, is based out of Alabama, where we have an interest in a flake graphite project. Now, Alabama was home to over 30 graphite mines during World War I and World War II, when the domestic trade routes were disrupted from wartime. And we're also investigating the potential for other critical minerals necessary for electric vehicles in the region. And then there's Standard Lithium in Arkansas, which is developing a very promising lithium project where they can directly extract lithium from the waste stream of an existing bromine operation. So we have the minerals. The battery manufacturers have actually also started to show up. Okay, there's Envision in Tennessee, and most notably and recently is SK Innovations with over $1 billion announcement creating, I think, up to 2,000 jobs to manufacture lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay? And Alabama is actually now one of the top manufacturers of automobiles in the United States, where Mercedes has recently made a $1 billion investment to manufacture electric vehicles. VW has made a similar announcement to manufacture electric vehicles in Tennessee. You also have the Aerospace and Defense Hub in Huntsville, Alabama. In addition, you have companies like New Flyer, which is the largest transit bus manufacturer in North America, which has recently built an R&D facility for electrification of their fleet in Alabama. And so I really love this being, this is my part of the world where I come from and where I work. And so I really love this because this is kind of the heart of what is kind of traditionally considered coal country in the United States. And it's really on the verge of becoming the backbone for the future of America's green energy. And that it's important to point out that the fact that folks on the ground in this region can now see that green energy can actually translate into a job for their local economy. It's incredibly significant. Okay, so what's the real challenge to bring these projects online? Okay, again, vertical integration is key to these projects' success. Okay, so you're essentially having to run a successful mining and advanced materials company in parallel. And if anything, the advanced processing capability is really the more crucial step for the critical mineral supply chain. There's an accepted kind of standardized methodology for how we look at a mining project and de-risk it. But there's been a major due diligence gap in how we can really de-risk the downstream. And there's kind of a lot of reasons for this. But, a lot of times the advanced processing components are based on proprietary technology. And this is something that's never been proven at a commercial scale, or at least in the United States. Again, a lot of these are new materials. They have new requirements. And so this is a new field. There's lots of unknowns. Traditional mining investors don't like that mining economics don't necessarily stand up on their own, or at least they're not overly attractive. And that the downstream component is really necessary to make the kind of project economics, sexy. And then the kind of flip side of that is if you look to tech investors, they really don't like investing in mining for the most part. So there's a lack of dedicated financing, particularly from the United States. And unlike China, U.S. investors generally lack a long-term vision and commitment. Everything is very much quarter by quarter. So the process from discovery to mining is a long and expensive process. And that's further complicated by the fact that you've got this parallel component of becoming an advanced materials manufacturing company. There was a first wave of exploration activity that was really initiated by the first Tesla Gigafactory announcements back in 2012. And, essentially overnight you had dozens of companies both looking for graphite, lithium, cobalt all over North and South America. But we've really lacked a poster child of success from that wave of activity. And many of the projects that were expected to succeed failed completely, sometimes at the last and final stages. In addition, so investors have just really not been rewarded. And this is not just something that's happened in the US or in North America. This is kind of across the space. And so there's difficulty in properly evaluating these projects in terms of the risk and the reward. And this is due largely to the fact, again, that these are opaque markets. They lack spot markets. There's the kind of terminal market is often unclear. And this goes back to the chicken or the egg problem that I mentioned earlier. So product value is based only on securing long-term contracts. And those long-term contracts are based on these qualification periods to become a new supplier. Okay, so when you can't just have an amount of material that's in the ground and you can immediately translate that to how much this project is worth. The value of these materials are based only on what people are willing to pay for it. And then that is, how much are they willing to pay and how much are they willing to commit to? So there's a lot of unknowns for investors. Some additional challenges, there's really been a politicization of mining and green energy. Okay, so not in my backyard mentality is strong in the United States, and that was really due to kind of a few bad actors, where U.S. mining earned a bad reputation over the 20th century as being bad for the environment and for human health. So these are very politicized topics. Traditional mining in the U.S. again is largely focused on the coal industry, and the coal industry has largely viewed clean energy technology as a threat to their way of life. The flip side of this is that most proponents of green energy or the Green New Deal are anti-mining. Environmental regulations are certainly worth mentioning. Permitting can delay projects, particularly when dealing with mining on federal land. So this is not irrelevant, but in my opinion, it's not the major hurdle. At least when it comes to critical battery materials, this has not held up what I would consider the better projects to date. There are good projects with necessary permits to advance, but they simply lack the funding. And it's important to remember, we're talking clean energy technology here. So these technologies require clean inputs. The whole idea is we're protecting our two most important resources, which are clean air and clean water. Okay, so let's look at what's happened at the federal level in the United States to support the domestic production of critical minerals. Okay, so here is a timeline, and for the sake of being brief, I'm going to just kind of focus on a few of these items. But this discussion at the federal level was really put in spotlight in December of 2017. That's when two things happened. Okay, the United States Geological Survey updated their full critical minerals report for the first time since the 1970s. Okay, so now they've been maintaining a list and reports on individual commodities over this time, but this was the first time that they really did a comprehensive and detailed update of the report in decades. And when they released this report, within a week of its release, President Trump signed Executive Order 13817, which was a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals. And to be fair, this executive order is essentially arm waving, but it has instructed the various federal agencies to work together and create solutions. And it's underscored that securing these supply chains should be a top priority. And it really put the biggest spotlight on this problem, since the end of World War II, when we were really having to deal with supply chain disruptions on a massive scale. Over the next 2 years, you had various agencies release their kind of reports back to the White House with their recommendations. There has also been several pieces of legislation introduced, and these have mainly been focused on the permitting aspects and increasing resources for updating kind of the national geological surveys and things like that. Let me bring your attention to July 2019. Okay, so the US and China were in the middle of a major trade war. President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act, something we've heard of recently given the coronavirus, for the medical supplies, but he invoked the Defense Production Act in July 2019 for rare earth elements. And this was focused mainly on providing financial support for the advanced processing of both light and heavy rare earths. And this actually unlocks significant levels of funding for the advanced processing of these materials. And this is something on the order of tens of millions of dollars. This is in response to the fact that China dominates the global market because they control the processing capabilities to separate rare earths and to make them technology ready. If you remember from the first week, Jordy Lee talked about rare earth elements, and he talked about the fact that actually we do have a rare earth mine in California. However, right now, that material, after it's mined, it has to be shipped to China to be processed into usable rare earth products, most notably permanent magnets. And so we essentially lose all of the control of the supply chain by having to export that material to China. A footnote to that is the Chinese actually have a significant interest in that mine. So the U.S. is very vulnerable to being cut off from China with regards to rare earths. And this enabling the Defense Production Act is to ensure the domestic capability to process these materials. Okay, and I'll point out something recently that's happened that's worth noting. So earlier this month, just a week or two ago, the Department of Energy announced over $18 million in funding for the research and development of critical minerals, again, mainly focused on advanced processing technology. The various pieces of legislation that have been passed over the last, or that have been proposed over the last 2 years have not been passed yet. So they're sitting on the desk of our Congress in different stages. So we'll just kind of have to see how those develop over time. Okay, so what needs to happen? Okay, we need to change the way that we think about mining and clean energy. Okay, we need to really in my opinion, we really need to come together politically on this topic because it really has something for everybody. This is an American opportunity. This is green energy, this is job security, this is energy security, this is national security. It should be something that we can all agree on. But we need to be able to place more value on securing sustainable supplies of raw materials. Tech companies, defense companies should be responsible for how and where they source these supplies. And we need to look for opportunities to localize and regionalize our most critical supply chains. Again, this has been underscored by the recent COVID pandemic. This would ensure that the mining and processing of these materials is done to the highest environmental and ethical standards. And this would also have the potential to greatly lower the overall carbon footprint of these supply chains by simply greatly reducing the transportation distances to get these goods from the ground to the consumer. Okay, so we need U.S. policies to facilitate this transition that encourage the U.S. sourcing of materials and manufacturing of these technologies. We need to find ways that we can get the defense industry itself more involved in helping develop these supply chains. We also need to look at like the oil and gas and the coal industries to figure out how we can get them involved. They understand resource extraction. They have geologists. They have engineers. In many cases, they're sitting on money, although we could debate what the last few weeks have done to that. But they need to find a way to transition beyond fossil fuels. And so there's lots of opportunities for industry partnerships and for federal industrial partnerships and consortiums to kind of form. And we also need to look at maybe potential ways that the U.S. government can help solve this kind of chicken or the egg problem. When necessary, is there a way that the federal government can actually become an off-taker of last resort to help ensure that these projects kind of meet the timelines that are needed to fill the demand that's coming? Perhaps we need to think about the concept of creating a national critical mineral reserve similar to the oil reserve. Now we have a strategic stockpile that we keep certain materials on hand, but I think we should think about different ways in which we can expand that thinking and even place value on deposits that are proven, that are still in the ground, to be able to somehow place an underlying baseline value for those projects that kind of creates comfort for investors. We really have to find ways to get American money into these American critical mineral projects. Okay, this may require, in some cases, federal subsidies or tax breaks. And this, I know this is a sticky topic, but this isn't about allowing technology that's uneconomic to exist. And I'm not talking about using this as a long-term solution, but I think it could help ensure the rapid mass adoption of these technologies and these capabilities so that we can compete globally and not be left behind. Let's not forget that the U.S. government still heavily subsidizes oil, gas, and coal, and has for a long time. So here are just some good resources that I wanted to share with the group for your kind of continued education on this subject. And with that, thank you.
Wow. So thank you all very much. We've got a dynamic chat session once again, lots of questions. Really appreciate everyone jumping in and weighing in. Let me pose a question here. Moderator privilege of posing the first question, and then we'll get into some of the questions from the audience. Let me ask you a really general question, but I think it's something that's popped up on our previous web in this series, and it's something we've talked where And that's sort of this low oil price environment and the short-term, medium-term outlook for electric vehicles. And I'm particularly interested because you talked a lot about some projects in the Southeast, and you talked a lot about some new factories that are focused on electric vehicle production. So let's start with that question for you. What's your take on the impact, or the what does low oil prices mean for electric vehicles? Good, bad, indifferent, short term versus long term? Why don't we start there, and then I'll wade through the questions and come back for some audience questions.
Yeah, my opinion is that, it's certainly in the short term, it doesn't help, but overall, this is a trend coming. Again, this is an improved technology. If you talk to people that drive electric vehicles, they love them. They're never going back. These are more efficient technologies, and it's really where our future is going. And so, to me, this is what's happening right now with oil and gas. Is it's going to have a short-term effect, but the overall long-term trend is absolutely still there.
So some things may slow down, like some of those factories you talked about. You think those will continue apace, and they won't be impacted at all?
Oh, I think the impacts will be certainly, slowed down over the next 6 to 18 months.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I don't think anybody knows right now. I mean, to be perfectly honest.
Fair.
But I think that again, overall, this is a trend that's coming. It's necessary. We need cleaner technology. We should always be striving towards better technology. And so I think it's what's coming.
So thank you. So there's several. We had a great back and forth here in the chat. I'm sure you've been able to see it while you were presenting, so I don't know how much you could absorb. But a lot of back and forth on lithium. But here's a question from Emily. Let's start with this question, and then we can maybe get into some specifics on lithium and water use. But first, how long does it take to get a mine from discovery through production? Is it longer for critical minerals?
Sure. No, it's a great question. So, first off, it's important to point out that the fact is most exploration companies have about less than a 5% success rate at making it all the way into commercial production. And so the odds are almost already stacked against you. And it's because it is such a long, lengthy, and expensive process. And so really, at a minimum, there are exceptions to the rule, but at a minimum, it's a 5-year process. Really, it's a 10-year process. So it's somewhere in that window of 5 to 10 years to where you're talking about making a discovery and then bringing that mine online. And that's if kind of everything goes well. And then the second part of that, as far as related to critical minerals, is again this component that it's not about just bringing a mine into production. That only gets you so far. What your customers need is a technology-ready product. And so the conversion capability and really proving out that technology, de-risking it, scaling it up in a kind of reasonable, responsible manner is I think the bigger challenge, and getting those relationships with your customers where they feel comfortable with your product and they're really willing to commit to long-term agreements.
That last point is quite important. Take a second and explain that quality, that sort of advanced critical mineral, those inputs for let's just say the batteries, and take a second to explain why that is different from, say, a manufacturing, industrial, some of the things you talked about with graphite. What's the distinction, and why is it so important in terms of that qualification of a supplier?
Sure. Well, just focusing on the case of batteries, but again, it's similar for a lot of the other critical minerals. But for batteries, you're talking about a very specific electrochemical process. Okay, and so that there's a very specific chemistry that has to happen there. And so again, it's not only about achieving certain levels of purity with your product or specific particle sizes. I mean, it gets very complicated. But so it's really about producing a consistent product over time. And this starts with the very first evaluation sample that you give a customer to say, hey, this is what I got. This is what's coming. They say, hey, we like this. When can we get more? And then it's a scaled up process where you're giving them more and more and more material. They're doing more and more rigorous testing. And again, they're basically waiting for you to mess up. You're trying to keep proving that you've got a consistent product and you can meet these specs time and time again, whether they're asking for 500 grams or 500 kilograms or 5,000 tons.
Yeah. And so that's hugely important to be able to demonstrate to one of these major buyers. So let's pivot. Let's take lithium. Let's stick with that, or let's take sort of that subject. There's some questions here about Latin America and the critical mineral profile of Latin America, which obviously lithium gets a huge spotlight in the lithium triangle in particular, which is Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, with Chile being sort of the one major, as of now, producer. Questions around Argentina's potential and Bolivia for that matter. But, Peru, Brazil, most recently Mexico have emerged. Take a little bit of what you can say, and I know your focus is much more in the U.S., but take a little bit of that. And then I want to, after we finish that, come back to the sort of distinctions. Well, as part of that answer, talk about the difference and what's different between brine and hard rock, and why those different countries have different outlooks for their lithium, if that's possible.
Okay. Well, definitely say there's a lot better experts. I'd kind of defer to Emily Hirsch on a lot of the geopolitics of South America. But I'll just say this, that I think direct lithium extraction is going to become the standard. The traditional evaporation ponds are certainly, it's going to be a part of the game, but it's definitely going to be moving towards direct lithium extraction. It's more efficient technology, and it preserves. It's more water efficient. The complexities of where we go as far as brine sources or hard rock sources, that's really based on the different battery chemistries that will be adopted going into the future. So, as we go towards a higher and higher nickel cathode, those require lithium hydroxide and not lithium carbonate. Now you can convert lithium carbonate to lithium hydroxide, but the main thing that I want to underline is how complex these markets are and how dynamic they are. And so, when you go to these battery material conferences and people talk about the trends, this is something that's changing, constantly. We know that we're going to go to a higher nickel cathode. We kind of thought that we were going to be there already. Now all of a sudden you're seeing from China that they're actually going back to lithium iron phosphate batteries, because that makes sense for them. That makes sense for their technology and the way that their cities are set up. So they don't have the range anxiety that we do in the United States. But all of that gets interwoven into the demand for all of these critical materials. You look at cobalt too. What will cobalt's role be in these batteries going forward? There's definitely a trend to try to kind of engineer out cobalt going forward, but there's certain applications where cobalt absolutely is preferred in the battery chemistry. So again, it's one of the challenges is how complicated these markets are. And, even people that have been immersed in this for years, it's still hard to really figure out where the trends are and where things are going. But the underlying all of this is that this is where technology is going, and the future of green and clean energy requires an immense amount of mining of raw materials, more so than the fossil fuel industry required.
No, I think, and that was an excellent point you emphasized in the Green New Deal, and the Green New Deal has, whether it's understood or implicit or whatever you want to say, is is hugely dependent upon these critical minerals and everything you've been talking about in the mining side of it. Just to finalize the point on sort of the role of water, and for those of us interested in Latin America, we've seen a lot of attention, particularly in Chile and in Argentina and Bolivia, about this issue. So just to be sure we understand, the way you see the transition in terms of the extraction method will obviate that water issue. Is that fair to say, or it will deal with the water challenge of lithium extraction in South America, the way you understand it?
Yeah, it'll certainly help. Yes, sir.
Okay. So you've been on the previous webinars, you've seen and you've heard the question pop up, and it's coming up today as well, about recycling. Could you comment a little bit about where you see recycling fitting into this the broader contours of the transition and some of the things that you've argued and talked about here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's critically important. And if you look at again, this is supposed to be clean and green technology, so we're not doing ourselves any favor if we're making all this new technology and then it immediately lands up in the landfill. And so there are ways to recycle and also repurpose these batteries. So there's two different things. At the end of life of an electric vehicle, a battery can still have quite a bit of capacity where it can be used for grid storage or repurposed in other ways. But then we can also essentially mine the old, we can mine the batteries in a sense, so we can process them and we can separate the different metal components and critical mineral components so that they can be reused. The main problem with this is the scalability of it. And so as more and more of these products get into the market, these projects will be able to be ramped up to a scale that becomes economic. But so right now we're kind of in this intermediate stage where these technologies are being proven out. There's some really good companies out there. We know that this can work and this can happen. And so as more and more of these, as this waste becomes available for recycling, the recycling industry for batteries will be scalable and will become more economic.
The question, which also leads me to a reminder, Shannon asked about if you could show the resources slide again, and if you want to pull that up, Jesse, I'll remind folks that we'll get this presentation out to everyone who's participating today, as well as the recording of the webinar. So no problem. But if you want to throw the resources slide again, there's a whole host of other questions. I'll sort of wrap a few of them up here. You talked obviously a lot about graphite. That's something you have deep experience with. So many comments here that silicon is replacing graphite. So talk a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah, sure. So these battery chemistries are changing a lot. So it's not only kind of traditional lithium-ion batteries. There's also solid-state batteries and other battery technologies. Lithium-ion batteries are going to, in my opinion, and most experts' opinion, are going to dominate for at least the next decade. And so where the changes that will be made to the battery technology, the improvements, will be essentially enhancing the technology that we already have. And so one of the ways to do this is that you can use silicon on the anode side of the lithium-ion battery. It has a much higher energy density than graphite does. The problem is that pure silicon has some expansion problems. And so even though it can perform better, it can also affect the long-term kind of structural integrity of the battery. And so the trend is that we're going to, and we're already seeing this. I mean, Tesla is already doing this. They're adding some silicon to the graphite. And so you're going to see kind of a mixture of materials show up in the anode. And there are companies that are also developing, they're engineering around the kind of the silicon expansion problem that you do get in the anode. But the short answer is that, we will see improvements to the anode. My opinion is that the graphite won't be completely engineered out for some time. And again, if you look at battery technology in general, I mean, lead acid batteries still have a huge share of this market. That's, over 150-year-old battery technology. And so the different battery chemistries are going to find different niches throughout the market, where for certain technological applications, certain chemistries will be preferred. And a lot of this is going to come down to cost as well. Really, how good of a battery do you need for a certain application? Can you get away with a cheaper battery? And so, a lot of these next generation materials, one of the questions is, how affordable are they really? How scalable are they? Something that I've dealt with a lot, trying to develop graphite projects is, every time a new article comes out about a new battery technology, your investors are calling saying, basically that the sky's falling, that, that these batteries are irrelevant. And, what the guys at Benchmark Minerals point out quite eloquently is follow the money. It's lithium-ion battery plants that are being built all over the world. And so you're not going to make these billion-dollar investments to build these big factories if you're not betting on a certain technology being around for a considerable amount of time. Now, there will be some components that can be kind of swapped in and out pretty easily. But the fact is that, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, the battery technology is going to look pretty similar to how it does today. However, there will be some significant improvements. And that's good, right? That's good for all of us.
I appreciate that. I mean, obviously the technology and the sort of pace of technology, and I guess that comes back to some of the things we've talked about so far, and how to incentivize or facilitate, whether it be government or industry. We're running out of time, but there's two or three things I definitely want to get to here. I want to wrap up with China, but before we go to China, a couple specific questions. The first one, vanadium. You talked about vanadium, and there's a very interesting question here about the potential in Mexico for Pemex, the national oil company, apparently has a bunker fuel that's rich in vanadium, and is that something they could extract from that source? So maybe a comment on that specific element, that mineral, and then one or two other questions, and we'll wrap up with your thoughts on where China fits in this going forward.
Sure. Well, I mean, vanadium is important for several different applications. So it's important as a steel hardener. And then one of the kind of unknowns is the scale at which it will be deployed in giant grid scale batteries. So these are called vanadium redox flow batteries. And it's kind of a wormhole. I don't know that I want to get down, but basically for certain applications, vanadium flow batteries are relevant, and vanadium will be used for that. There will be demand. I don't see the demand being enormous, just because I think the lithium-ion batteries, for the most part, are going to be able to outcompete the vanadium flow. Now, that's not always the case, and there's people that'll disagree with me, and that's fine. I don't have all the answers, but there's other forms of battery technology that are going to be important, particularly as we start looking at grid scale storage, and vanadium flow batteries will have a role in that.
You don't have all the answers, certainly have a lot of information and answers, and we greatly appreciate you sharing it with us today. Let's take sort of deep marine. There's been a lot of discussion, especially in the South Pacific, but then even off the coast of Spain, there've been some. Take a second to help us understand what's going on with sort of marine mining of critical minerals. Is that something worth thinking about right now? Any thoughts you want to share on the deep marine critical mineral environment?
Yeah, I think they hold huge promise. I'll say I'm not an expert on that, but from what I do know is they hold huge promise. I think they need to be done in the context of, can it be done right? What's the environmental impact of that going to be? But I think that, absolutely, there's some really high grade, interesting places on the bottom of the ocean. And so if we can find a way to effectively, cost effectively get those minerals and bring them into the market, then we should absolutely do that. But it should be done responsibly. The whole point of clean energy is to, make the world a greener place for all of us.
that showed the.
I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm having trouble getting
Oh,
the screen sharing back up. Yeah, I
okay.
apologize.
Well, I was going to ask you to put the slide where you showed the dots of China in the process where you had those percent. Let's wrap up with. Okay, so from that slide and from some of your thoughts there on China, there we go. Yeah, there it was.
Oh, you can see
So
it up here.
so we look at that. I mean, the famous picture says 1,000 words. If you just take one of those pieces, so China is absolutely, as you say, exerting vast control over step in the supply chain. So geopolitically, this is huge, and ever more so perhaps right now with this current environment of the coronavirus for not just the healthcare reasons, but all the reasons we can. What do you see? And is people talk about this, the new Cold War. I'd like to get your thoughts from somebody who's in the space in what you see as how this will play out, and not just between the U.S. and China, but perhaps through some proxies. In our case, we're very interested in Latin America and where China is exerting itself also in Latin America. So let's wrap up with your thoughts on China, what to do, how do we manage that, and are we being alarmist? Are we not?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, first of all, I don't hold it against China that they're trying to protect their own self-interest. The United States, dominated the 20th century because we were a fossil fuel rich country, and China was not. They were vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, but they saw the kind of the future of energy and the future of technology, where it was going, where it was headed. And for several decades now, they've put a strategic plan in place, which has basically said that we want to be good at this technology. We want these jobs to come to China. We want to be consumers of this technology. So it's important to point out that if you look at electric vehicles, the Chinese are going to become the largest. They already are the largest consumers of electric vehicles, and it's going to be the case into the future. And so we can't hold that against them. But what I think we need to do is we need to protect our own self-interest too. We need to realize that they've been playing the long game for a while, and we've been kind of holding on to the past technology because that's what we're good at, and that's what's made us money. But the technology is changing, and we need to be able to change with the times, and we need to be able to do so at a pace that makes us competitive. If we wait another 10 years to kind of get the big picture on this, then you're going to have these mature, well-established supply chains coming out of China and also Europe, where they're really going to realize the economic benefit of making these investments, now. And so, at the same time, China has used critical minerals as a way to kind of weaponize trade wars. We've seen this with rare earths in the past. And so, they know it gives them leverage, and they're going to, they will certainly use it in some cases, but again, to protect their self-interest. So I think I don't want to really get into the U.S. versus China and really, get all dark and gloomy on what that might look like. But I just think that it's in our best interest to secure these supply chains for our own economic prosperity and to kind of secure the future of energy for America.
No, don't worry. I'm not going to drag you in and create any more or foster any more between the China and U.S. situation. I think this is important for those who are joining us from Latin America. That already we've seen a huge deployment of BYD buses, and just about all of the electric bus deployments in the region, seemingly BYD at this point. So I think the best way is to be continued here for sure. And we're at the top of the hour, 11 a.m. in California. So we'll wrap up by saying thank you very much to Jesse Edmondson, and I also want to thank my team, Sanchez, for running this webinar series so well, and Cecilia Aguillon, who is, I know, working closely with you, Jesse, and talking all the time about many of these issues. And Cecilia is the director of the Institute of the Americas Energy Transition Initiative. So she'll be hosting a webinar that we're going to do on renewables in Argentina, a little bit outside this critical minerals series scope. But anyway, that's a week from today, the 30th. And just the final thing I'll say is May 7th, we'll have the U.S. Geological Survey, and we'll be wrapping up this critical minerals energy transition webinar series on May 7th with so thank you for your time. Thank you for your information. We will get this out to everyone. We really appreciate everyone's participation. You're blowing me away with the back and forth on the chat. Thank you much. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been my pleasure. Have a good day.
Everyone, stay safe, stay healthy.